Yeah, Joseph is here.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the last day of the International Conference on Biometrics. It's the last day, but not necessarily the worst day. In fact, we have two very interesting talks today. The first one is from Professor Didier Meuwly. Did I pronounce well?
Yes.
This is from the Netherlands Forensic Institute and from the University of Twente, Netherlands. He specializes in automation and evaluation of the probabilistic evaluation of forensic evidence, particularly biometric traces. The biometrics field now has a long history, 20, 30, 40 years ago already. Thank you. But the biometrics and the forensics world, they have been isolated more or less during all this time, I guess I would say, to their mutual detriment. But I myself, yesterday talked from the FBI showed that it was not until the late 90s that they really fully automated. And I myself was involved in 2006, 2007 in a project with the graphology group of the Spanish security forces. And when we met them, they were doing analysis 100% one, but just a 2006, 2007. So I hope that in your talk today you will reconcile these two worlds, forensic and biometrics world, and show us how they can benefit each other. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. You can listen to me. So first, I would like to thank the organizer to inviting me for this talk and to have the opportunity to expose you the link between forensic and biometrics and how they can mutually benefit to each other. I have to say, when I received the invitation, the first thought I had was about AVBPA 1997. I was thinking, oh yeah, Furui was giving a keynote speech there that I still remember very clearly. So I will do my best that in 20 years you will still remember my talk. But unfortunately this morning there will be no birds. That's a talk for early birds as far as I can see. But there will be no birds in the presentation. So don't be so disappointed. I will first talk a bit about the Netherlands Forensic Institute, that you understand a bit the kind of environment I work in. Then some definition, then I will briefly focus on the biometric modality that are of interest for us, and then we will jump on the core of the talk, that is a forensic biometric application, and I will focus on the investigation process and on the evaluation process, because they are the most important. And I will have a little part of the talk about validation, because this is a topic I'm currently busy with. And finally, one slide conclusion if we get there. That's the building I work in. It has been built in 2004, and it's really built for the purpose of forensic science. It's very well built. I'm a Swiss citizen, so it's easier for me to send a bit some flowers to the Dutch people. It's very nice building to work in. We focus on criminalistics. It means that we make use of science for criminal investigation and evidence evaluation. We are not doing criminology. And we have an integrated model in which our biggest activity is delivering product and services, but we also have a R&D and innovation program and an education and training program, and I think the model is a bit the same as a university medical hospital. And I think it's a very good model, but it's not applied in a lot of countries. In most of the countries, the forensic laboratory have mainly a product and service delivery without having the two other aspects. We also suffer from the reduction of budget due to the late effect of the crisis. So our staff is going down at the moment, and the number of cases we are doing as well. We have managed our relation with the requester of casework, a service level agreement, and we are doing a certain number of cases for them. It has some disadvantage because we cannot do everything anymore, but on the other hand we are prioritizing things, and we are also reducing the turnaround time necessary to give them an answer. The organization has changed very recently, 1st of April, and I work myself in 2 departments. The first one is business support, and the other one is, of course, biometric traces. And as you can see, most of our activity is in DNA, that's the red part of this camembert, but we have a large part of different type of expertise in-house, about 40 field of expertise, going from pathology to firearms, from drugs to fingerprint, from paint analysis to speaker recognition. Our requesters are of both types, Dutch and international. Mainly it's law enforcement and police, that's the big part of our request. But as The Hague is physically very near from international institutions like the International Criminal Court, the Tribunal for Lebanon and ex-Yugoslavia, we also have contact with them, and we are also working for the UN quite regularly. The R&D, we have a large number of R&D programs that are supported by the different field of expertise in relation with a university, and biometrics falls into the R&D program forensic recognition and individualization. And finally, we have an education and training program. We are educating our own practitioner. That's why I was absent on Monday, because I had a teaching part for our practitioner. We also are teaching the Dutch and international law enforcement practitioner, and that's a very big aspect. If you want people to understand what you are doing, you have to educate them to understand what science, how science can help them. If not, they have their own idea how science can help them, and it's obviously not the exact way we can help them. We also have collaboration with university. We have about 10 people, including me, who have a part-time professorship in a university, and so it's in forensic chemistry, in criminalistics, in forensic statistics. In all these fields we have a link with universities, and it allows a shared project, and I think it's a very good model. The Netherlands Forensic Institute for 20 years has invested a lot of energy and time in the European network of Forensic Science Institute. That's a network that links about 60 forensic laboratories in Europe, and it allows to develop together guidelines, to have working group, to try to harmonize the activity in the different countries, harmonize the method, and get to a best practice at the European level. Now I go to the definition. So I try to define first forensic science. It seems maybe obvious for everybody of you, but I want to focus on some part, because forensic science is very often seen as an application of a modern science. But actually it's a science in itself, and it's not always recognized. So forensic science as one object is the study of crime and its traces. Traces are the most elementary information that results from crime. They are silent witnesses that need to be detected, seen, and understood to make reasonable inference about criminal phenomena, investigation or demonstration for intelligence, investigation, and court purpose. So it really doesn't focus on the technique, but it focuses on the object of the study and the method and the purpose of the study. Now I have a definition of biometric recognition. I hope you will recognize yourself in it. That's my own interpretation of it. That's the human-based and automated recognition of individuals based on their physical, biological, chemical, and behavioral characteristics. Biometric recognition allows to differentiate human beings and to recognize them to a certain degree, and this depends on different aspects. It depends on the modality. Not every modality shares the same quantity of information that allow to distinguish between people. The quality of the data, that is very crucial in forensic science, in a lot of other applications as well, like if you want to recognize people in an unconstrained environment, without asking them cooperation, for example. And it depends on the application. One-to-one verification test is not the same, doesn't have the same difficulties that 1 against n identification process if n becomes very big. So forensic biometrics is the mix of the two. So it's the application of human-based and computerized biometric recognition methods and technology. And I think it's very important to mention human-based and computerized, because forensic science is never an automatic process, is at best a computer-assisted process, and very often it's still a quite manual process. So we are using biometric technology to analyze biometric traces and reference specimen. And I insist they are specimen and they are not sample, because we are normally having one trace, and you cannot ask that these traces are representative of the feature of the person. It's only one specimen taken, and the quality is as is, and you will never be able to influence this quality of the trace itself. And we are using these traces to answer different questions. The first question is about the origin of a biometric trace, and in forensic science we call that the source level inference. We want to know from who is originating the trace, who is the source of the trace. We are doing also inference at activity level that leads to activity that leads to a biometric traces. That's called activity level inference. And finally, the last level, that is a level that is more for the lawyer, is to discuss if the activity is constitutive of an offense, and this is more for the legal person to assess. And so there is this 3 level where there is communication between the requester and the scientist. Biometrics has focused a lot on source level inference, obviously, but as we see in other field of biometrics, it also extends to answering question on activity level, and this like surveillance camera, who are looking if people are just rushing to a train or if they are fighting, and this is also a type of technology that we could use in forensic science. About the biometric modality, there are a lot of biometric modality. I put some examples here that are of interest, and actually this slide is more to exemplify the boring list that I have after. I started with this, but it was not very appealing, so here is a list of the slides before, but what I wanted to show is some of these biometric modality are physical or behavioral. And this, I think, it's very well known in the biometric field. Some dichotomy who are maybe least known are about where do these traces come from? Are they physical and physically collected? Imagine a finger mark collected on a crime scene. With a pencil, this is something physically collected. DNA is physically collected. You have some traces who are digitized. The face is a physical object that is digitized with a camera. The same as for voice. The voice is never physically collected. It's always recorded through a digital medium nowadays. The gait, the body measurement, the geometry of body extremities, these kind of modalities are digitized. And some are purely digital. The keystroke, the touch screen dynamics, biometric authentication. And from this we can go to think in which kind of cases we are finding which kind of traces. So on physical traditional crime scene we find most of the time physically collected traces and digitized traces. In cybercrime we find digital traces, obviously, also some physical but mostly digital. And some are not traces. Iris is just a very marvelous technology, and I wish when we would look at some object, our iris pattern would stay on this object. It would make our life so much easier, and the collaboration with John a lot bigger, but it's very rare to find an iris in a forensic case, apart if you have a high quality picture where it could be used. Contrary to a finger mark, if you touch any object, your information about the finger mark stays on this object. That makes a trace that has been exploited for more than 100 years. And some information is more for post-mortem individualization, for example, the size and shape of hard tissue, the teeth, the bones. This can be used comparing post-mortem X-ray or CT scan with the ante-mortem information. You can make very good inference about the identity of a person. But of course, it's not a trace you find regularly on a crime scene. About biometric technology, I will not say anything because I'm a user of the technology and you are developing it for us. I'm not a specialist at all of the algorithm development. I try to follow and to be enthusiastic of the development, and I see them and I benefit from them. I just want to reconcile on one slide the type of wording we are using. We see mainly two aspects: the feature extraction, when we have the reference specimen, that is somewhere a recording, that can be a visual, audio, and from this we extract a template. And we have a trace specimen from which we are extracting a test specimen. And then there is a second phase that we call the feature comparison. Some people call this step matching. I try to avoid this word because in forensic science this word matching has a very fuzzy definition. In the same times it tells that two objects fits from signal processing point of view, but in the back of the mind of a lot of people, it also means they originate from the same source. And it's always in between these two realities that they are using the word match. So I avoid this word. When we use the word comparison, it makes a lot easier. So basically, you have a template and a test, you compare them, and you get an information that can be a distance, that can be a probabilistic score. I just summarized that in the word score, and I will use it later in the presentation. So now, how integrates this biometric technology inside the forensic process? Because it's only a part of it. Everything starts on the crime scene, at least for physical, traditional crime scene. If it's digital, it's a bit different. There is very often a crime scene, but the traces are remotely captured, sometimes also locally, but also remotely through the network. So you have the initial issue, the scene investigation, and then there is a crime scene assessment where people are looking which kind of traces they have found, which kind of scenario they can envisage, and which kind of request they have for a forensic laboratory. And then comes the second part. The first part is called case assessment and case pre-assessment, when they come in the lab with their traces, with their stories, and from these traces and story we try to extract some hypotheses we can test, and we try to understand exactly what are the questions and how we can answer them at best with the traces we have. And on this basis comes a decision about which kind of techniques will be applied in the laboratory, and this is at this moment that the biometric technology comes in the game. With the analytical method, so you consider the feature extraction part as the analytical method when you extract the information from the raw data, and sometimes it's not very easy because you have videos from which you don't know the codec. You have to reconstruct the information in order to get access to the information, then you extract it. And then you go to the comparative method, that's of course the feature comparison, to get to a score. And that's for the computer-based approach. Apart from this, there is also a human-based approach. If you think about speech or face, there is also an expert doing this work independently, looking at the feature, extracting the feature, comparing the feature. And for example, our face recognition procedure asks that 3 people are independently applying the same procedure, and at some steps they reconcile and they try to get to a common view on this. And if they can, they report this, and if they can't, they also report that they cannot get to a common view. Then there is the interpretation, and that's the question: in which context is the request made? What is the question? You can have a request about identity verification or identification, but that's more the police who does this work and this process. You have intelligence request when you are asked to link cases together through traces. There are investigation process when you are asked to generate hypotheses who could be the source of the trace you are observing. And there is the last part, the evaluation process, that is very often considered as the forensic process, but it's actually only one of several. That is the evaluation, to provide a value of the evidence in the context of the case. And this can be done human-based or computer-assisted. You see, I use the word computer-based and computer-assisted because it's not an automated process. And then there is a reporting, and the reporting is in two parts. There is a written part normally, and for identity verification you can provide a decision. For intelligence you can give links between cases. For investigation you can give rank list, and for evaluation you can provide a strength of evidence in terms of a likelihood ratio. And reporting, I said it's in two phases because you have the written part, but you also have to go to court. Sometimes to defend your report. And the secret of defending a good report is when you have written a report that is short, concise but complete, and when you go to court you are able almost to answer all the questions from what is already inside your report. That's the best situation. But it's not always the case. When our lawyers try to put you on the situation where they invent some new scenario on the fly during the court session, you have to refrain them and say, yes, I can envisage your new scenario, but in order to do this, I still need to go back to the lab and test this scenario. I cannot just answer you like this without having done any test. So now we will focus on these two scenarios, on these two approaches, the investigation and evaluation, because they are the most important. As I said before already, these different scenarios compare different type of specimen. Verification is reference against reference. That's the easiest situation. That's high quality information against high quality information. Intelligence is the most difficult. It's trace against trace. Investigation is trace against reference database. And evaluation is a trace against the reference of the suspect. Okay, so in forensic science we are producing decision in case of identity verification or identification. We are also producing an information that is a selection. It's an activity of selecting cases who are relevant in the context of case or cases, linking cases together or generate hypotheses, linking people to a case. And the last activity is a description. The forensic evaluation is a description of the strengths of evidence, and it's not a decision. It's very often seen as a decision, but it's not. Before to go further, I just want to make one point about the fact that every biometric process relies primarily on enrollment. And this has nothing to do from near with the forensic process, but we are dependent on the quality of the data and the database we have. And I just want to show you some data who have been acquired in the context of passport. People are requested to give their fingerprint for a passport. And this is real data, and you will understand very soon that if this process is not carefully monitored and the quality management is not done properly, the forensic process cannot also take place, like any other forensic biometric process actually. So this is good print that we have observed, but the large majority of the print were looking like this, partial, top of fragment, or insufficient surface, or they had too low or too high contrast. And you can find a lot of artifacts. You can see skin damages. For this you cannot do much because it's a problem of the source itself. And we have some who are really very ugly. And some I would qualify quality comparable to a mark, but they are captured as reference material about the people. And of course, if you have this type of reference material, there is no process that can be put in place. And I think it's important that a biometric process, including the enrollment, is not seen just as a commodity, or it has to be monitored a lot better. But I know there are some development. NFI Q2, for example, has been developed in order to help in this type of processes.
When he hands over a demand note, the staff set off the security screen. He makes a run for it. But he's forgotten he has to pull the handle to get out. Eventually, he resigns himself to his fate and waits for the police to arrive. Then, an elderly customer walks in, and he realizes his mistake. He still hasn't been caught.
Okay, there are several comments about this little video. First, the average quality of a CCTV. I've used this video already, and I showed it to my wife, and she said, "But you will not show this, it's horrible quality." I said, "Yeah, but this is just a reality." And on the other side is the fact that when people are under stress, they are losing control, and actually more he loses control, more he produces traces. That's the funny part, and I think in forensic science, you have people who are normally producing traces not in a normal situation, and it's very obvious, for example, in speaker recognition, we rarely have a conversation between two people who is very quiet and very normal when it comes to discuss the criminal activities. Okay, what do we have? We have information about the face in this video. We have information about the fingerprint. We have information about the body height. And we have information about DNA. So DNA, we can discuss if it's a biometrics or not. I think it is. It's just not a real-time answer, so that makes a difference. And I think it's difficult to use in a lot of biometric scenario because of contamination of DNA. We are shedding our DNA basically everywhere. So we will focus a bit on these three modalities: the face, the fingerprint, and the body height for the rest of the example I will give. And this idea that the criminal activity has such an intensity that people cannot completely manage. It's not very new. It has already been discovered in more than 100 years ago by a very famous French criminalist, Locard, that maybe some of you know. Okay, now if you have a finger mark found on this crime scene, you want to know who is the suspect. So you would like to generate a list of people who can potentially be the source of this trace. So in the Netherlands, it appears in this way. You have a DNA reference, fingerprint reference database that you hope is better quality than the one I've shown you before. You have the reference collected, and you have an automatic fingerprint identification system that has been presented by James yesterday. And I think important in this slide is the people who are behind this AFIS, because it's a highly automated process, but you have to know that marks are getting several times searched until they are popping up with the right candidate. That's for the difficult mark. But we also observe that with the incredible development in signal processing, now up to 60% of the marks are linked to what is considered the true source. The problem is, in forensic science, you never know the ground truth, but it's considered as a true source at the first rank in 60% of the case without human intervention. James was referring about this with lights out mode. So we can expect that in the future, more and more encoding and searching is done automatically. So the traces are recovered, compared pairwise in the database. That's why the system needs to be very quick. And finally, you get with a selection of candidates, and I always used to say normally they work with 20 candidates. But if in the Netherlands the king would be killed, I would not be astonished. They would consider the first 10,000 or even the first 100,000. So there is the size of the list is not fixed. So this is an example. This is what happened in the Atocha bombing in 2004 in Madrid. What they have found is a plastic bag near to, I think it was in the car next to the train station, and on this plastic bag they found this mark that is not of extraordinary quality. And it is where, when we speak about forensic science, you have always two elements. One element is the intrinsic quality of the mark and its capacity to distinguish people, and the relevance of the mark. And often there is no relation between these two. So the game of the criminal investigator is to go on a crime scene and to pick the relevant mark of sufficient quality. So what happened in this case? This mark was sent to Interpol, and Interpol, thanks to the link all over the world, and also thanks to the IFEs in the US and all the different AFEs in the world, have access to 10 billion fingerprints. So it shows how powerful is such a system. It's a very scalable system. But of course, if you have a mark of such bad quality, imagine the analogy if you would have a face with a bit blurred, you searched against a billion people, 10 billion fingerprint, billion people, you would find somebody who looks a bit like you. And not astonishing, this is what happened. The American reported a first candidate, and the Spanish reported the second candidate. And when you see these two fingerprints, they look extremely similar. It shows how powerful are this system. But in the same times, when you are using a biometric system at such a scalable level, this is what you get, and you need to be aware about this. And you are not anymore in the one-against-one situation where a lot of fingerprint experts put themselves when they consider this problem. So what happened is there is only one source of this mark, but there is two suspects, and maybe none of them is the source of it. This we even don't know. What happened finally is the American considered that Brandon Mayfield, who was a lawyer living in Seattle, was not the source of the mark, and until now it's still considered that Mr. Daoud is the source of the mark. But I also have my question mark about this, because firstly, the Spanish have said this mark is not good enough to be put in the process. If you think in broader term, if you consider a suspect in Seattle when the case was in Madrid, you need to almost you have half of the world population, several billion of people. It means that in the case you have an enormous potential population, you have an enormous searching database, and you have low quantity of information in the mark. There is still discussion about knowing if it is a single imposition or a double imposition. This is not still clear, and there is a large amount of distortion. There is a weak clarity in this mark, and it means that there is weak links with the suspect and weak strengths of evidence. But this was not considered with the right framework, and you end up in this problem. So the investigation phase was absolutely fantastic, but the evaluation phase was not at the level at all. And so we are asking ourselves the question about the lookalike. They call in the forensic field people who are looking similar from some biometric feature the lookalike. And the question is not if they are existing, but how rare are they, or how rare are these similarity what we observe. So they can be the genetic reason, there could be some cultural reason, there could be some religious reason, there can be some random reason. There are also finger marks who look very similar, and it can also be. You listen, this is very bad quality. It's telephone speech. It's two twins. That's a colleague of mine in Germany who had made a database of twins, and the question is what is the probability of having this situation? And normally, people consider that there is no genetic relation. They don't envisage very quickly this hypothesis of twins or of brother or sister in a case when actually it's not so rare. Okay, then the next question is forensic evaluation is how strong is the evidence, and that's called forensic evaluation, and basically it remains to have a biometric trace and to ask you the question, what's the probability to observe the feature of interest if the trace originates from somebody from the population, or if it comes from the defendant, because the suspect, when he goes to court, it becomes a defendant. So you have two hypotheses. The defense hypothesis is the biometric trace originates from another person of the population, and that's called the defense hypothesis because normally the lawyer is defending this one. And you have the prosecution hypothesis is normally defended by the prosecution. That's the biometric trace originates from the defendant himself. And then the question is, what's the value of the evidence in the context of these two hypotheses? This is getting to the scenario to define the hypothesis. And this alternative hypothesis sometimes is difficult to get from the defense party, and it can change a lot. It's very different if it's anybody else in the world, anybody else in the country, anybody else in the city, anybody else in the family. And so you need to adapt the request to the context of the case. So we have several aspects in this. You have the hypotheses themselves, the prosecution and defense, HP and HD. You have the evidence, that is the observation of the comparison of the feature, the score. You have the background information, it's all the other information in the case, and then you can calculate first the numerator of the likelihood ratio, or the information about the intra-variability, the similarity factor, we call it as well, that's the probability to observe the score if the trace and the reference come from the same person. And then you have the denominator of the likelihood ratio, that's the inter-variability, or the typicality, or the rarity of the similarity, and this is the probability of the evidence to be observed if the trace and reference come from two different persons. And when you merge them together, the numerator and the denominator, you get the strength of evidence, that is the likelihood ratio that is used as a metric for it. And in biometrics, we are using the score given by the technology as the observation, as the evidence. And there is discussion at the moment if it's right from statistical theoretical point of view of doing this, or if we should only work with the feature-based approach, but that's a bit too much to be discussed today. So then you need to assign the strength of evidence. So what the requester normally asks you for is the posterior probability ratio. He wants to know the probability of these two hypotheses, and mainly the prosecutor wants to know the probability of this hypothesis. And he would be so happy if you could tell him if it's 1, and that the other one is 0. So that would be a categorical decision to say, yes, Mr. Judge, it's the guy, to exclusion to anybody else in the world. But you understand, working the biometric field, that this is not possible to be given only based on the comparison of the trace and the reference specimen. Because this information is based on two other information. That's the strength of evidence and the prior probability of the hypothesis. That can change a lot depending on the case. And normally you don't know completely about this one. So you are only able to report about the likelihood ratio. And this is what is said by the people who have developed this theory in forensic science. That's Graham Jackson, one of my colleagues from the former UK Forensic Science Service, who was explaining the difference between the role in forensic science, forensic investigator and forensic evaluator. And this is not a new idea. Jules-Henri Poincaré, who is well known probably in Europe and particularly in France, he has been appointed to review the Dreyfus case, and it was in 1906, and he said in his report, in the impossibility for us, forensic evaluator, of knowing the prior probability, we cannot say this coincidence proves that the odds of it being a forgery have this or that value. We cannot say about the posterior probability. We can only say by observing the coincidence, the odds become this much larger than before the observation. This is the very definition of the likelihood ratio and the strength of evidence. You also have it in French. The problem is, how do this translate in the practice? It's very difficult because it's not so intuitive as going to the judge and saying it's the same guy. And if you see the degree or the type of knowledge the forensic people have, they normally have knowledge in biology, chemistry, physics, at best, or in biometrics, but not really in all this inference theory. Okay, I will now give you an example with the body height. That's our guy in the case, and you can imagine that we have measured that this guy was measuring 1.81 meters, and depending on you can have different uncertainty on this measurement. And normally in casework, the uncertainty is between 10 and 5 centimeters, sometimes 2.5, but not much more, because you need to reconstruct the position. Do you have the shoes? You have the position. It's very complex. Then there are the question: what is the relevant population? Is it the world population, or is it the Dutch population, if it's a Dutch case? So you can have these two situations. Then you have a defendant, and this defendant is measured 1.82 meters plus minus 0.5 centimeter. If you look, you say, yeah, it fits quite well. Let's go for it. Okay, let's go for it. You can go through a feature-based likelihood ratio method when you will measure the rarity and the similarity of the feature without getting through a score. And then you will start to think, okay, how are these population, this feature is distributed in the world population, and you see that it's not very discriminant, and you also observe that the influence of the relevant population. The Dutch women are almost as tall as the world. The men, if you take a man coming from the world, is not very much taller than if it's a woman coming from the Netherlands. So you need to choose your right population. And then you can assign the strengths of evidence. You have your observation. You have the relevant population. We can make an assumption this was a man. So we are looking using this data here. And then we can measure the strengths of evidence. And the strengths of evidence, of course, it depends on the precision of the measurement. Lower is the precision, lower is the strength of evidence, because you take into account a larger part of the population. And at best, you get a likelihood ratio of 30. And with 1 centimeter uncertainty, for 2.5 is 12, for 5 is 6, and for 10 is 3. And this is if you take the world population. Bad luck for you, this guy is very near from the average Dutch man in terms of height. If you are in the Netherlands, this strength of evidence becomes a lot lower. It means you cannot identify based on this feature, but you cannot also not say this feature has no value. It has some value, and I think the role of forensic science is to bring every piece of information and provide its correct value. And the idea is that you will combine different type of information to get to a strong evidence. And I don't believe in a new DNA very soon, but I strongly believe in using statistics based in networks, for example, in order to combine different type of information to make the strength of evidence stronger in one way or the other way. And every information should be used at its own value, and that's a way to get there. Now I have a second example. That's the bombing in Zaventem in March, and it's about face recognition. I think you all have seen these pictures. You may still remember that the first discussion was that this guy was a suspect. That was the first question. And okay, so you have this picture. If you make it a zoom, I don't know if it gets better or not, but actually, this is only public available information. I have to say, I don't know if they had other information of biometric information, but this is only information we have, or considered as best information we have. Then there is this guy, and suddenly another guy came in the game. But maybe you could have another guy. And this guy, it looks quite nice as well compared to the picture. He also has a hat, it helps a lot. But you see how we are, perceptually, we are already influenced by this type of information. So Sunday morning, I always listen to my favorite radio, that's Radio FM4, that's from Austria, and that's a Canadian radio guy, and he does a very nice, entertaining broadcast called Sunny Side Up, and I record it as well. So I use it when I go to visit Raymond 3 hours in the train. And I was very puzzled when I listened to this.
It was especially when Mohammed Abrini was confronted with facial recognition results that he then said, yes, it was indeed him who was on that picture, the third person, the so-called man in the hat, caught on that CCTV video inside the Brussels airport shortly before those attacks were conducted. In spite of the results the investigators are getting, they say they realize that potentially this is not the end of it. They fear that there could still be people out there who perhaps provide logistical or other support to this terror network.
So you picked that it's when he was confronted to the results of facial recognition. And I'm thinking, wow, if they have such a software, I also want it. But I was even more puzzled when I listened to this.
Van de bewakingscamera in de vertrekhal. Hierop is het gezicht van de man met het hoedje duidelijkst te zien. Met gespecialiseerde computerprogramma's hebben speurders beeld voor beeld grondig geanalyseerd en de kenmerkende punten in het gezicht gemeten. Zulke beelden leveren een schat aan unieke informatie, zegt professor Siddhartha Gautama, expert in het verwerken van forensisch beeldmateriaal.
Dat kan de vorm van een kin zijn, de vorm van de neus, afstand tussen de ogen, de lengte van de mond. Maar kunnen zelfs nog een stap verder gaan en je kunt kijken naar hoe iemand wandelt. Hoe iemand wandelt is zeer karakteristiek, waarbij dan als een aardslag of een vingerafdruk. En dan kunnen we dus ook uit die videodelen halen die getoond worden.
De speurders hebben de informatie vergeleken met een recente foto van Mohammed Abrini. Wij hebben alleen de opsporingsfoto. De speurders hebben zelf nieuwe foto's van Abrini kunnen maken sinds zijn arrestatie, vanuit hetzelfde standpunt als de bewakingsbeelden. En zo kunnen ze zelfs nagaan of een bewust hoedje op zijn hoofd past.
Uit die beelden laten bijvoorbeeld ook een driedimensioneel beeld. Dus die beelden laten toe als je die persoon vanuit verschillende hoekpunten ziet, om daar een volledige vorm uit te halen. Of te kijken van de vorm van het hoofd die we uit de beelden zien, of die al dan niet past bij het hoedje dat ze voor ogen hebben.
Abrini heeft zelf zaterdag bij zijn eerste verhoor verklaard dat hij de derde terrorist van de luchthaven is. Voor het federaal parket is de fotoherkenning een sluitend bewijs dat hij daar niets over is.
Okay, here it comes the photo herkenning, so it's already not the face recognition. So my question is here, what is the circumstance? Which assumption did they make? Did they have a closed set, an open set? What is the contribution of the face information? What is the contribution of the location, of the hat, of the cloth, and how did they combine all this information? But I'm quite puzzled when I listen the information provided by this professor, because I think it doesn't represent what people in the biometric community would say, who are present here. And also, it shows that when you have a knowledge in one field, it doesn't mean you are directly forensic expert in this field. And I think this testimony is quite representative of this situation. And I don't know exactly if he worked on this case, and I asked more information from the people who did the case, but of course they cannot say anything at the moment. But I said I will chase them until I get the information after to understand how they apply the process. But what we can say is, I was speaking about the European Network of Forensic Science Institute, and this is the type of document that is done. It's a guideline for evaluating reporting in forensic science. And it has been produced in 2015, and there is a part about CCTV case. They give an example of the CCTV case, and they also show you how you should report this. And you should report it like this. The finding for the examination support the view or the proposition that the person indicated on the CCTV still is the person on the photos or image of item X and Y, rather than the individual is another adult male. So it's really providing the strength of evidence. And this strength of evidence can be given or with a numerical value or with a verbal scale. So if you would report 1, it means there is no support. If you would report 2 to 10, or the verbal version, you would say it's weak support for one to the other one, or one against the other hypothesis. From 10 to 100, that's moderate support. From 100 to 1000, And then from 1,000 to 10,000 is strong, very strong, and extremely strong. And when I see the picture on the video, yeah, there is some information. It's like for the body weight. I would say this information is probably in this region. I'm not an expert myself, but I would say you may differentiate 100 people on this basis, but certainly you cannot identify the person on basis of the information we have and the picture, the reference picture. So I think the best we can do in such a case is to provide a strength of evidence, but it's never communicated in this way. And I don't know what was done in the back office, but it's sold like if it's an identification of basis of what we have seen. And I want to show you some results of a PhD that has been done in Twente. That was a PhD of Raymond and Luc on face recognition. This person did work with off-the-shelf algorithm that is very much used in forensic environment. That's the Cognitech 2-day FaceWax SDK. And he has first measured the performance of the algorithms on known database, and they show equal error rate of about 1 in 1,000 that I find very good, but it's not error-free. And on some other database, including the database of the vendor, that was about 1%. So that gives a bit the performance of the algorithm. And then he tried to observe the performance of this algorithm in different circumstances that are more forensic, like, for example, moving the orientation of the face, and the picture quality is quite high, a lot better than in our case. And then this is the result he gives. He shows that when you are comparing a face against face, the results are very good. And as soon as you are influencing the specimen with some orientation, the results fade very quickly. And this is considered one of the best 2D algorithm in face recognition. So I can't imagine there is such a much better algorithm in the back office of this forensic case you have seen, that they could get rid of all these problems. So that asks really what they have done in this case. Okay, now it's the last part of my talk. It's about the validation of this computer-based evaluation method. If you look at the forensic process, the first part of the crime scene is, as a standard, is 17025, so people work under accreditation in this standard. For the analysis part, you have ISO 17025, and for the evaluation of human-based approach, you also have an addendum to the 17025. But when it goes to software who are used to produce strengths of evidence, there is nothing at the moment. So it means it's a bit in the wild and people do what they want in this field. So the proposal is really to complement this approach, and this is what we have worked to. This is a PhD student that was in the BB42 project quite a long time ago now, but we are still getting the benefit of this work that was done. The question given to him was, does the likelihood ratio method developed for FINGERMARK forensic evaluation compute the correct strengths of evidence? And that's not a very easy question, because mainly in forensic science you have the ground truth at the level of hypothesis, but no quantitative ground truth what is the strength of evidence. So what he has done, he has defined some performance characteristic, what to measure to be confident that this algorithm works in the forensic context. So he's defined accuracy, discrimination, power, and calibration that are known. And then secondary performance characteristic, who are measuring different aspects of the primary, and he called them the robustness, generalization, and coherence. And then we used known performance metrics and a graphical representation to measure and document these different aspects. And this is the CLLR min, the CCLLR cal, the equal error rate, LR range, and this kind of aspect. So it comes, some of the work is coming from Daniel Ramos, who did his PhD about the cost log likelihood ratio. So this one you know very well. That's the detection error trade-off, and you can see that there is a difference of discrimination between systems. What you don't see is that there are two systems who are reporting the same discrimination under the black curve, but there are some aspects who are different, and these aspects are the calibration. You see the system 1 and the system 3, they have a difference in discrimination. That's a Tippett plot. It shows the likelihood ratio under the two hypotheses and the strength of evidence that you can expect. But then you also see the system 2. The system 2 has the same discrimination as system 1, but the calibration is different, and meaning that the Tippett plot is moved on one side, could be on the other side as well. That's the difference of calibration. Then you can measure the calibration. That's the work of Daniel Ramos. You can measure the performance of systems. So this system has a discrimination loss that is higher than this one. So it means the performance is inferior. These two systems have the same discrimination loss, but they have not the same calibration loss. So we are measuring this type of element. And here you see the empirical cross entropy, and you can compare this information of the CLLR min and the CLLR cal for different systems, having here the level of chance, and you see that such a system very soon for a large part of the prior on this side has a performance which is worse than tossing a coin. So you see the same discrimination loss and different calibration loss. So we applied that to a fingerprint system with marks with different number of minutiae, and you should expect that the performance goes better and better because you enrich the test specimen with more minutiae and more rich surface. And we had a problem looking like when we go from 10 to 11 minutiae, we have a performance who degrades. So it means it's not coherent because you add some information that should be valuable for distinguishing people, and the performance gets worse. And we got to know that inside our black box there are actually two algorithms, and of course when you pass from one algorithm to another one, you have a problem. So we reported that the coherence was a problem because you have this increase of errors in the system, and you can also observe when are the system better or worse than tossing a coin, and we also observe that in some situation, particularly with low quality information, the range in which the system is informative is not very big, so it's also an alarm. So finally we have set up such an approach in which you have the performance characteristic, the performance metrics, the validation criteria. You do your experiment, you declare which data you are using, the results you are obtaining, and then you decide if it's validated or not. And this follows a procedure that is described in ISO 17025. So in this case we have observed that the coherence was not okay, and all of this to say that in the back office, that's our Swedish colleague who developed automatic face recognition system, they are using this kind of approach. So it means it's not that people are applying blindly this software like it can be seen in the I suspect in the case that I've shown, but there are people who are really developing this and showing what the strength of evidence depending on the kind of results you get, and you see normally the strength of evidence is quite limited in realistic forensic case. It also is developed in speaker recognition. That's my own colleague who has developed this way of showing the equal error rate when you have a test and reference specimen of different length in speaker recognition, and you can see the results for one software we are now validating, in which region should you be in order to produce proper strength of evidence, which kind of quantity of information you need to do that. So there is a large work that is done in this field. So consecutive to the PhD of Rudolf that I've shown before, we have produced a guideline for the validation of likelihood ratio method. And then Christoph Busch at IVBF 2014, he told me, but we should complement an ISO standard with such information would be valuable. And I said, okay, that's a very good idea, let's try. And now what we have tried, we have made a long way from the PhD to the ISO standard, and we are at the step where we are having just sent yesterday a new work item proposal for this ISO standard, and we hope that finally this becomes an accepted methodology that some forensic people are already using it, but we hope that will develop. And I have also to say this guideline is the first guideline, but I'm happy if the whole community thinks on improving these tools in order to get a better knowledge of the systems in forensic condition. I think we cannot have an infinite number of tools, but we have just to segregate and select the best tools. We have proposed some I think are quite strong, but maybe we can complement and improve this, and certainly it will come. Okay, I'm at the conclusion. A forensic biometric evaluation method, it needs to be logical, so you need it to be in a framework where you are using the information in a proper scientific reasoning process. It has to be balanced. It means you have to provide the strength of evidence relative to a set of hypotheses, and these hypotheses have to be relevant. The method has to be robust. You have to show that in forensic condition it still keep this capacity of discrimination, and it needs to be validated, and that's what I have developed in the last part of my talk. And you still need to understand that the strength of evidence computed is relative to the hypothesis tested, and that's very often forgotten, that it's kind of overgeneralization that the results becomes absolute, and that's the game of the lawyer to change the hypothesis in court. And it's conditional to the method used. Meaning if you use different method who focus on different feature, you get different results. If you envisage our first case from the body height point of view or from the face point of view, you will get different strengths of evidence. And if you are using different face recognition software, you will get different results. Doesn't mean that if one report 500 and the other one report 400, that there is something wrong. It's not an accountant system. It gives you a range of strengths of evidence, and if people are reporting information in the same range, we can consider it's the degree of precision we can expect from that. Okay, thank you very much. If there is time for question, I'm happy to try to answer. Too early after the conference dinner.
Then I have some questions for you, maybe to share time, but I will see if you want. It still seems to be some isolation between what can be provided from forensic, from biometric science to forensic science. You have talked about this Brussels case, and you don't like very satisfied with how it's been handled. Why do you think this can be the reason? Due to lack of communication from scientists of what can be provided, lack of trust of the users of police in this case of what they can get from us?
I think there is a large interest generally from people for the forensic application. There are several restrictions. We are not a mass market, so it means that we are not a scalable market because the number of forensic institutes in the world is quite limited. So it means a limited number of potential customers, so that probably refrain somewhere the industry. So we are somewhere a spin-off in the sense that we are using algorithms developed from some other purpose, and we try to adapt them to our scenario. There is a restriction about the data. We have talked about it yesterday, so that doesn't make it very easy for a student to come to work on this data. For the rest, I think that we are constantly puzzling between the situation, should we develop our own algorithms? Because our own algorithms, they don't need to be so fast for evaluation purpose. You can let run the number crunching for weeks if necessary. We search for quality because we come from very low quality information, so we don't want to lose anything in the process. And in the general biometric environment, if you think about access control, there is an enormous pressure on providing the results in real time, for example. And so we are puzzling, should we use the algorithms developed for some other purpose, or should we build our own algorithms with all the uncertainty that is related to this, because we are small groups, we don't have large resources to do so. So that's probably the environment in which we are working. Yeah.
Yeah, but I remember some years ago, I don't know in specific cases, camber thing on the screen, not for real. You see the market share of biometrics. There was a big chunk of it related to AFIS and biometrics towards security forces. I find it interesting what you say, but because a lot of money was being put for instance investigation, and it seems that still something is to be done, and there needs.
Yeah, for the different process, I agree with you that the AFIS process is a very established process and there is a lot of money there. But for forensic evaluation, it's a lot less developed. Yeah, it's true.
Any other question from the audience?
Just curious, what's being shown on the screen?
This picture of the screen, yeah, it shows a paradox of biometrics. It shows that we are working on some invariant, and actually you can see actually a person getting older, showing this is an artist who did that.